what we're seeing is that I wouldn't say it's a new player, but the military establishment, for example, it is over the recent years is more and more so finding its footing in this sector, this concept of corporate farming, which you're much more well aware of. How does their influence, how does their involvement now change the dynamics? Because some decades back, it was run by feudal elites, also known as landed elites, and now we have this institution which is like other sectors of the economy is now becoming a key stakeholder here as well.
So I've had a chance to sort of go and spend some time because being a development anthropologist and the degree I was doing, so I did spend quite some time at one of the leading corporate farms in Pakistan a few years ago now, but the kind of model it had set up, and here it's not just corporate farms within Pakistan. Actually, a lot of the momentum for this has come from entities like the World Bank. So back in 2006, I was a fellow with the Open Society Institute in Budapest. And I was looking at the issue of participation in the poverty reduction strategy paper, right, for a couple of years. And I looked at it specifically in Pakistan, but also traveled, to sort of different countries. And in the party, which you'll probably be familiar with, was used, that kind of an approach emerging out of Joseph Stiglett's critique of country ownership, lack of country ownership, and structural adjustment, one size fits all, right? And he was, of course, the Nobel Prize winning chief economist at the World Bank. And then in 1999 at their spring meeting, they sort of launched the poverty reduction strategy paper approach, IMF and World Bank, and there were lots of issues around that, the glass ceiling and how come Uganda's poverty reduction strategy paper looked very similar to Pakistan's and Nepal's. Everyone talking about microfinance as the way to alleviate, poverty, etc.
Yeah.
But one of the issues in there was corporate farming, for instance, right? And I mean, it comes at it from sort of those efficiency arguments that if you look at, the amount of available land, the water stress, these kinds of issues need, you need economies of scale, you need technological input, and the corporate sector, of course, has the resources to manage these processes.
Yeah.
But what happens is, I mean, I was surprised to see corporate farming mentioned in the poverty reduction strategy paper, because the farm that I went to, had a lot of capital intensive, like threshers and harvesters. They had a semi-perennial, access to irrigation, so they created these massive ponds on the farm, and they were using drip harvesting, sort of very efficient, good people from the Faisalabad Agricultural University, etc. But you see those benefits, and they were USAID was helping them export their mangoes to Western markets. So all that stuff is happening, but from the rural poverty context, you see, they had 400 or 500 daily wage women who were coming to the farm, who were being paid. They were being paid in a timely manner, but the wages that they were getting were no better than what they would get elsewhere on a farm. Now, and if you look at now, imagine me coming in as a corporate farmer in somewhere in Sindh or the Punjab, and you are a sizable landowner, and you have a let's say 50 acres, and you're farming, and you have, because you can't do it yourself, you and your sons, so you will have agri laborers, you might even have 4 or 5 sharecroppers who've been there for generations. Now, if you get like someone who's extremely well known, who is entrepreneurial, and he gives you a check for 3 years to lease your land, you just rather go with him and just like forget about all that headache of farming yourself. But then what happens is that you don't need those men who are farming, and then those men don't have any jobs at the corporate farm. So, that corporate farm was, it was basically using seasonal laborers who would come in from elsewhere. Again, they weren't really getting big bonuses like the management team was when, they were
Mm.
incentivized. So it is not really a rural poverty reduction strategy. The farm
Mm.
does well. I mean, if it's, if it's keeping its books right, it can even on a self-assessment basis give money to the government. But, there's so many leakages everywhere. It's not like the government is super efficiently then channeling that money into rural development. So, so you see, unfortunately, something like corporate farming also not delivering in terms of, addressing this problem of the rural populace that doesn't really have anything else to do. I mean, they haven't been given the education, they don't have the economic opportunities. So then what do they do? And then simultaneously, there's pressure to increase efficiency, to increase exports, right? And growing crops that should not be grown in an ecological zone like Pakistan, like sugar, right? I mean, a tropical grass
Yeah.
essentially, very labor intensive, profitable
Yeah.
because of the way that
Yeah.
the permit Raj has been set up. But so I mean, there really has not been, in my view, the market mechanisms and the structural adjustment reforms and agricultural liberalization has not really been able to percolate down to the poorer segments of rural Pakistan, and in many other parts of the world. In fact, it has increased that blight.
That's actually a very great point, and I would like to highlight that we usually tend to use the jargon human-centric policies, where you put people in front of the policy, making sure that the end result is greater prosperity for those stakeholders. But corporate farming may not seem to really check the box in terms of, like you said, alleviating rural poverty, addressing the needs and the demands of those who currently are at the base of the pyramid, sadly and unfortunately. So what would be a key solution? How can we address this problem? Or like what are some of the measures that can be taken at least so that we're on the right trajectory? So I'm not looking for obviously, an end-to-end solution to the problem. There are multiple components, but what do you think? What can be done to make sure that we are treading on the right path?
So, I mean, some of these things are already there. It's a matter of sequencing. Some are very thorny issues, which have these deep-rooted vested interests, like trying to do land reform when the military has a sizable
Mm.
interest in agricultural land. When I mean, still, yes, feudal families over time have, changed sort of where they draw the power from, but in the last several decades, you've had this irony. Was it Fanon who said to rule over land is to rule over people? Because when you did have these large parcels of land and villages living there, I mean, those were captive vote banks. So no wonder you'd see a feudal also being in the legislature, and he's not going to axe his own foot by doing land reform. So even when Bhutto did do it, I mean, all the sort of lacunas that were found in that process. And I think some lessons were learned by 77, Mubashar Hassan and others who were working with him at the time. But, that uh, didn't have much time. I mean, some argue that he had sort of conceded, others argued that no, he was going to actually talk about, putting in place, which is very, so one suggestion, concrete suggestion in the present is try and implement a minimum wage for the Khet Mazdoor.
Mm.
I mean, these guys are literally, working for this obviously no contract, and things like computerization of land records. I mean, the bank's been throwing money at it. I mean, since a while, not only in Pakistan, in so many other places. When you look at the digitization process, what that does is, it takes this. I mean, if you happen to see those handwritten manuals of the
Yeah.
patwaris,
Oh,
right, digitizes them. But you see,
absolutely.
the problem with that is that it is not trying to do a spot check to see how those records were managed, because those records, there's a lot of fabrication, there's a lot of
Mm.
creative accounting
Yeah.
in there. You see, because the Patwari doesn't even have an office. These now, I mean, turning to sort of some more conceptual issues. I mean, there's this whole discourse around Foucauldian discourse around the idea of corruption, right? How states with weak capacity sort of enable or tolerate corruption as a means for them to manifest themselves. Imagine, I mean, if you had to be a Pakistani cop, right, with a motorbike and standing 12 hours in the sun, and you couldn't take any bribes for coffee and tea, would you want to work that job?
Of
Right.
course not. Yeah.
So Akhil Gupta spoke to this idea, right, of corruption and sort of agency so I think that one can't simply talk about, so Patwari does not have an office. So he's supposed to like find his own office. Often it's the larger landowner, right, who'll give him an office and send him tea. So he will, and these are very, I mean, I can't take names, but I know even very reputable people who have, who have these, they've been renting out their land because they're two columns. One is a cultivator, one is the owner. Often you'll see people, because they don't want a headache, so they will just say we self-cultivate, even when they don't. And the Patwari will put them as a self-cultivator when they are not. Because, if someone else has been cultivating for a while, you're obligated to first offer them the land, they have some rights over time, tenancy rights. So, to avoid that hassle, those land records are incorrect. Now, the idea was that when you make them transparent, they digitized, I can go in, give 100 rupees and get the record, and I'll be like, hey, this is not correct. I'll have this fixed. Transparency is going to lead to accuracy, but that is, again, blind to the power dynamics. I mean, if I'm like barely able to, survive, and I owe money to the landowner, even if I have that piece of paper, so what? What is that? It's the same way that, with Islamic laws, you have fine women don't get, the equal share, they're supposed to get half the property, right? I mean, family law, all of that. I mean, now you go to rural areas and you see how many brothers give half their property. And even that's complicated. Like I've actually asked people who, there was a Haji Saab somewhere in Gujarat. This is like a rich agrarian, it's not southern Punjab or, some part of Sindh where there's extreme poverty, very well-to-do, very politically aware, constituency. And he was a very nice person, with several sons and daughters. And I said to him that, Haji Saab, how come, you're gonna give all your land to your sons and, not to the girls? And he said, look, I mean, he said this jokingly, but, look, when they get married, their brother would have done the same thing, right? So they will have access to some land. But, it's also, look at the obligations placed on the brother, right? I mean, where here in the West, can you imagine if you find the right person that you're going to defer gratification, you won't get married till your sister's married. And you're going to first put together money for her to get married before you do your own. So, you have to look at these things. You can't look at them in a piecemeal manner and then just like reinforce tropes. So, I mean, but at the end of the day, there is social ostracization. Women will go to the Patwari and say, we've gifted our land to our brother. He sold it to us. I mean, the good brothers will send grain to their sisters, but women are not, they are not managing land. And these are women whose families can afford to give them land. I mean, some do very rarely, but if you look at land ownership by women, you'll see what a glaring omission there is, even of Islamic law.